Tom Wright is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Regional Plan Association, the RPA. It's the nation's oldest independent metropolitan research, planning, and advocacy organization. It's a private, nonprofit corporation. RPA improves the prosperity, infrastructure, sustainability, health, and quality of life of the New York City, New Jersey-Connecticut metropolitan region. They do this by preparing long-range plans and advocating for their implementation. As president, Tom led the production of RPA's landmark fourth regional plan, released in 2017, which proposes 61 recommendations to reform public sector institutions, modernize our transportation systems, address the challenge of climate change, and provide affordable and livable communities for all of the region's residents. As a leading thinker on urban and regional policy, Tom is a frequent speaker, lecturer, and commentator on economic growth and development, transit investment, good governance, and other public policy issues. Prior to being named RPA's president in 2015, Tom was RPA's executive director. Tom has helped lead many key RPA initiatives, including the historic Civic Alliance to rebuild downtown New York following the September 11, 2001 attacks, the campaign to create a mixed-use district for Manhattan's Hudson Yards, the protection of New Jersey Highlands, and a vision plan for the city of Newark. Tom was also the project manager for our Region at Risk, RPA's influential third plan for the metropolitan region, which was published in 1996. Before his current tenure at RPA began in 2001, Tom was Deputy Executive Director of the New Jersey Office of State Planning, where he coordinated production of the New Jersey State Development and Redevelopment Plan. In the early 1990s, he was RPA's New Jersey Director and coordinator of the award-winning Mayor's Institute on City Design. More importantly, Tom and his family are co-residents of ours here in the Princeton community. Tom's a Princeton graduate. Tom's an advocate for local issues as well as regional issues. And for me, most significantly, Tom is a friend and an advisor and someone who has provided, like Marvin has, a role model for me to emulate in public engagement. I introduce to you Tom Wright.
Very warm introduction. I'll say it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Talk a little bit about RPA, some of the work we've done, and more broadly, some of the large trends that we see shaping this community, New Jersey, and the metropolitan region. I'll say I do talk around the country and the world, but kind of being close to home is in many ways more intimidating than going anywhere else. And as you were kind of giving those welcoming remarks, I was reminded Bob Getty's was actually my freshman year in college. I had the good fortune of taking Architecture 101, an introduction to the built environment with Bob Getty's. There are many friends and colleagues here in the room, and Marvin and Ingrid, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And in fact, growing up on McLean Circle, Bud and Tita Vivian were our neighbors, and they were kind of like surrogate grandparents for me, and so it's wonderful to see you getting an award named for them. So I'll give just a little bit of a history just to explain again. I think Kevin did a great job. Regional Plan Association's been around for 96 years. We're a private nonprofit that looks at the entire metropolitan region, essentially Trenton to New Haven, Long Island, the lower Hudson Valley. Here's the region as we've kind of defined it, parts of 3 states, 31 counties. I want to thank everybody in the room who helped, because just a few years ago I used to have to say it incorporated 783 towns and cities, but we're down to 782 thanks to the incorporation of Princeton Borough and Township. But I will still point out that of those 782, one of them is New York City and its 8.6 million people, and 781 are not. And of course, land use planning in the United States tends to happen very much like this morning at a local issue. And so thinking about what happens across municipalities, because traffic doesn't care which town it's in, pollution doesn't care, air quality, water quality, all of those issues transcend political boundaries, but often the kinds of institutions that we set up are thinking just that way. As Kevin mentioned, we've produced kind of over this history, I worked on both the third and fourth regional plans, but back in 1929 we produced our first plan. We did a kind of comprehensive economic assessment of the region, where it was going, what kind of growth patterns were going to happen. And in particular, what we saw was, at the time, the threat that we saw was overcrowded conditions in New York City. The Lower East Side, this was the time of Ellis Island and people moving in. And so we put out recommendations for kind of expanding the region to give people access to open space and clean air and sunlight and better housing conditions. We essentially laid out the highway system. Very famously, the Port Authority was going to build the first bridge across the Hudson River at 57th Street, thinking that that's where people wanted to go. And RPA provided this kind of analysis that said, let's think about a circumferential system. You don't want people driving from the mid-Atlantic to New England coming through Midtown Manhattan. And so the GW Bridge was moved to the tip of Manhattan instead. We did also put out plans for mass transit investments, which were largely not built. And if you look very closely, you'll see a dotted line running down 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. So we are nothing if not persistent. And so we have worked on certain issues for close to a century now. In the 1960s, we did a second regional plan because, if anything, nobody really saw just how the automobile suburbanization trends in home ownership and other things would encourage and incentivize people to move out of city centers. And so, alarmed by the declining population in many of our older cities, we produced a second plan, a series of reports really produced in the late 60s and early 70s that kind of argued for creating what we call a constellation of centers. That we would identify places like New Brunswick, New Jersey, White Plains, New York, Stamford, Connecticut, that would be connected by robust mass transit systems. Getting federal funding for mass transit was one of the maybe few big successes we had during this period. And then in the early 90s, we decided to do a third plan, kind of more robustly looking at those recommendations again, identifying open space, things like the Highlands Council, Governor's Island and recreational opportunities in the Inner Harbor, preserving eastern Long Island and kind of protecting watersheds. And in particular, making kind of doubling down on 3 key transit investments that we laid out in '96. And what we said is that the purple ones, actually, there are kind of 4 on this map, building that 2nd Avenue subway finally, extending the number 7 subway out to the west side to create more commercial development out there, connecting the Long Island Railroad to Grand Central Terminal. Actually, the tunnels under the East River had been built in the 70s and then abandoned. So finishing that project called East Side Access, and then building a new tunnel under the Hudson River to double capacity under the Hudson River. What I'll kind of say about this is the day we put this out in the spring of '96, none of these projects had any public funding behind them. None of them were being thought about very seriously. We also said to pay for it, we can charge people to drive into Manhattan. Now, from New Jersey, you might think we already pay, and we do, because the Port Authority manages those crossings. But most of the crossings of the East River and from the north are free into Manhattan, and so people aren't paying to drive in. When we put this out in the spring of '96, there was no congestion pricing in London and Stockholm and Singapore. It hadn't been done anywhere. We didn't even know what the technology would be. And none of these investments were priorities. Today, a few years ago, we opened the first phase of 2nd Avenue subway. Several 100,000 people are riding on it today. The main beneficiaries of that investment are not the people who ride on it, but the people who now get on the train on the Lexington line because they're not forced off. East Side Access, it is behind schedule and over budget, but in about 4 years, that new line will open. The next time you're in Grand Central and you're looking at the beautiful clock and you look straight down at your feet and realize that 120 feet below you, a second terminal has been hewn out of the rock and will open in about 4 years. And more than half of the Long Island Railroad riders will soon have a 1-seat ride to the east side, completely changing the economic geography of Long Island and East Midtown. And of course, as you may know, we started a tunnel under the East River about 9 years ago, and then in his infinite wisdom, Governor Christie canceled the project, and we are paying for it today. Hudson River, sorry, thank you. And I'll come back to that later. So about 5 years ago, we decided it was time to do a fourth regional plan and revisit these issues, think about the new trends that were shaping the region and what we should do about them. The first thing we did was lots of consultation, events like this today, all over the region, because again, we're a private nonprofit. The plans we put out have zero weight of law. And so we did consultations, we visited sites, we commissioned studies. The first piece we put out was something we called Fragile Success, to kind of map what had happened over the 20 years since the last plan had been produced. One thing to realize is that we made enormous strides. If you go back to the early 90s and compare today, and especially in New York City, there have been a lot of changes, and many of them for the good. We went as a region from having a lower life expectancy than the rest of the nation to leading the rest of the nation. Even as national life expectancy rates improved, we went from worst to first in that area. Our economy has prospered. Lots of things have gone well here. But we still have too few opportunities for many people. The affordability crisis is terrible and getting worse. The suburbs are now falling behind, and I'll talk about this. The economic geography of our region has completely changed. We are more vulnerable to natural disasters, of course, stronger storms, more flooding, sea level rise, and in particular our government institutions, things like the Port Authority, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, New Jersey Transit. The agencies that are supposed to be doing the investment and planning and thinking for us are really not able to today. They have been hampered, and in many ways there's a crisis going on. Just to get into a little bit of this, I, like many people, actually, we lived on the Upper West Side when I was 3 years old, and then like many folks, when my dad took a job at the university, we moved out here to Princeton. That was the trend during that time. The last quarter of the last century, we were essentially living in a suburbanizing economy. And for every 10 jobs created in the 31 county region that I talked about, roughly 1 of them was in New York City and 9 of them were outside New York City. The wealth belt of New Jersey, as Jim Hughes has coined it, Fairfield County, Connecticut, Nassau County, that's where the job growth was. It was IBM in the Hudson Valley. It was the pharmaceutical industry here in New Jersey. Over the last 10 years, not only did that trend stop, but it completely reversed. And today, New York City gets close to 9 out of every 10 jobs created in the entire 31 county. Just to kind of put a finer point on it, if you went back this map to 2003, over a 10-year period, each of these lines represents kind of starting at 0 for each of them. You see that the Great Recession of 2008 made a slight bump in New York City's employment increases, and then it just turned around and went on again. Whereas at the bottom here, northern New Jersey and southwestern Connecticut, only about 2 years ago did we regain the jobs that we had prior to 2008. So job growth has been, recently it's starting to pick up again a little bit here. But this is completely, in the mid-90s, we were writing reports that would say New York still matters to those of you in New Jersey and Long Island. And today that has completely reversed. And that's something for us all to be aware of. Another thing is that the jobs that are being created are by and large jobs. The gains in employment, many of them are in industries that pay below average wages. So you can kind of see that the industries above the horizontal line are the ones that are growing, and the ones below are losing, and manufacturing, not surprisingly, is kind of there at the bottom. And the ones to the right pay higher wages, and the ones to the left pay lower wages. And so you see that retail, leisure, and hospitality, other services, tend to be the ones that are growing. Professional and business services is the one area that the outlier on this, and in particular, of course, the tech boom in New York City, which has really been very strong and seems to be accelerating, if anything. But that's an outlier in this. Meanwhile, as I talked about affordability, this chart compares from 2000 to 2015. How many households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing? And what you see is across the board, the numbers going up very dramatically. In particular, from 2008, the recession was caused by, of course, a kind of bursting bubble in the housing market and the mortgage financing and everything blowing up. What happened during that recession was new home production declined dramatically, and it has not picked up again since. Even as the stock market has recovered, even as we've seen job growth go up, we are still not producing homes in this region at the rate that we were. Now the types of homes that we need are not the kinds of houses that we were building in the 80s and 90s, the large lot single family house of 4,000 square feet or more. Today what we need, of course, we're seeing kind of especially growth in the over 65 cohort. And what many of those folks want are smaller apartments in walkable communities that give them a wide array of options right outside their doorstep. But the housing production has not picked up. And frankly, we know exactly where this is going to go if we don't change this, and that's San Francisco. And rents in the Bay Area, as high as they might seem in New York, they're about twice as high in San Francisco. I have gone out there, I went out there last year and met with the head of government affairs for Facebook, who said, we're just not sure we can keep doing this anymore, paying these people astronomical salaries and giving them tricked up vans to drive from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. It's just not working anymore. Well, we're headed in that kind of a direction, and so housing production has got to pick up and start to meet the demand. Otherwise, rents are going to go up. Today, close to 3/4 of households in the region just simply cannot afford to buy. It used to be that home ownership was a kind of attainable goal for people. It's simply out of reach for an increasing share of our population today. We also know that this is very tightly tied to the physical environment and public health. Today, where you live, your zip code, is a greater predictor of your length of life and your overall health than your genetic code. And there are enormous discrepancies in small geographic areas that simply should not be allowed to persist. And in particular, and I think this is interesting for everything you hear about in Washington and national healthcare debate, but 80% of a community's overall health is going to be a factor of place-based conditions. Is it a walkable place? Do you have access to healthy, to clean air and water? Do you have a job and do you have a place to live? Those are more important than really many of the things that we talk about in terms of healthcare. And then finally, I'll say travel patterns are changing dramatically. And this shouldn't be a surprise to folks, but just kind of going back over a 20-year period. What you see, of course, is it's on a very small base in terms of working from home and biking, but the large increases. Today, nationally, just about as many people telecommute and work from home as ride mass transit. And mass transit, of course, has been the largest increase in this region. Lately, that's turned around. In fact, subway ridership is now declining in New York, even as jobs and population increase. The first time in the history of the city we've ever seen that. And that's because of the conditions on the subways, overcrowding and deterioration. And of course, the crisis that we face with New Jersey Transit today. And it is truly a crisis. I will say I have a strong vote of confidence in the current leadership there, and Governor Murphy has been putting much more money behind it, and that's necessary, but it's going to take a while to turn around what's happening here. And so, meanwhile, of course, auto travel is going up very, very little, and what we're seeing, of course, with technology is the transfer from people driving themselves to more Ubers and Lyfts and the car sharing and other things. And those mobility companies are now buying bike share, e-scooter companies, and kind of looking at themselves as continuous transformation platforms. I mean, I know what Uber's business model is. They want to get to a point where with one click of the button, you can have a trip where you might take a scooter from here to the Dinky, ride on the Dinky, get on the train, and that the whole thing is essentially being managed through their platform. And probably they would do a better job of it than the public sector is doing. Just to give you a sense, I'm sorry this is kind of washed out, I think. But to give you a sense of what's happened, in particular, over the last 20 years with commuting patterns. From 1990 to 2010, while New York City started on this growth of jobs and other things, Long Island basically didn't increase at all. The net number of commuters from Long Island into New York City didn't increase over a 20-year period. Why? Because there was no capacity on the Long Island Railroad, and because the communities in Long Island won't allow multifamily rental housing anywhere close to a train station. They were kind of stuck in a 1950s mindset, frankly. Connecticut saw 5,000 additional commuters over that time, larger increase in reverse commutes, Hudson Valley 8, and New Jersey 70,000. I haven't got a slide for this, I'm sorry, but I just kind of finally got the 2010 to 2015 numbers. Long Island has actually started to shoot up over that period of time, and this is a period of time over which New York City added roughly 750,000 jobs. Long Island saw its share go up by about 22,000, and the investments that are being made in the Long Island Railroad system, East Side Access and other investments called Third Track and doubling of the main line, are now starting to point to growth on Long Island. Connecticut actually grew by another 5,000 over that period, Hudson Valley by about 15,000 over that period, but in that 5-year period, New Jersey increased by 50,000. Over a period of time, almost for every job created in the state of New Jersey, roughly, you also have somebody else in New Jersey commuting into New York City. It is probably, I've said this in Trenton and they don't like it when I say it, but probably the fastest growing, best paying industry in this state is called commuting to Manhattan. And so that's just the reality that folks ought to be aware of. It can't continue the way it is for 2 reasons. One is that Manhattan is kind of filling up, and the other is we don't have capacity under that river. And just to give you a sense of how people get there, you can kind of see this map shows commuters by travel mode. And what you can see is that Long Island and Connecticut, really with Metro North and the Long Island Railroad, do a very good job of kind of pulling people onto their systems that are at capacity. And they're now, again, looking for ways to grow. Within the city, it's all on the subway. And then in New Jersey, it's a kind of hodgepodge of rail, bus, and people who drive. Because we don't have full coverage in New Jersey Transit, we are over-reliant on buses, I would argue, and over-reliant on people driving into the city. Neither of those modes are going to be, in the long term, very viable options in a filling up city. And so we ought to be thinking about how we make sure we still have rail capacity, because I do think that's going to be necessary for us. So we kind of took these numbers and these trends and we started to think out 25 years at RPA. First, what we did, and this is an important graphic for us, we looked at the population and job growth in the region from 1990 to 2015. And what we saw was that we added about 2 million jobs and 3 million people over that 25-year period. That's a period that included the recession of the early 90s, which was very severe for us, and the 2008, which wasn't quite as severe. But what we saw was that 18 and 15% increase over that time. If you look at the federal numbers, the city numbers, all of the projections of growth for northern New Jersey, New York City, and the tri-state region over the next 25-year period, 2015 to 2040, you see growth trends and expectations of about half of what we saw over that 25-year period. Why is growth expected to decline by so much over that period? It's not because people don't want to come here. It's not because industries here don't want to grow. It's not because of any of those factors. It's for 2 reasons primarily. One is because we don't have enough housing, and 2, because we don't have the infrastructure. If we had the capacity, the sense is we could continue to grow, but we won't because we don't have those investments. When you think about what we need to achieve as a community, as a region over the next generation, we need to green our energy supply so that we're emitting less carbon. We need to provide prosperity in communities that are not sharing in this wealth. We need to provide more housing opportunities. The way we do that as a society is through growth. We finance these things by the growth increment. We know that if we build it, people will come, and we use that as a financial mechanism, essentially, whether it's the public or the private sector, to do that. A low growth future makes it extraordinarily hard for us to figure out how we are going to get renewable energy sources, how we are going to invest in New Jersey Transit, how we are going to finance affordable housing. What we did then at RPA, we worked with moody'seconomy.com and other economic outfits, and we said, if we lifted the restrictions, if we said, what could our economy and our population achieve without those limits, what would it look like? And we actually came out with these numbers of about 2 million jobs and close to 4 million people. And growth rates very close to what we experienced over the prior 25 years. That is because, again, there are industries that want to grow in this region. Tourism continues to go up, leisure and hospitality. The tech industry continues to want to come here. We have a well-educated population. So then the question from our perspective becomes, what are the policies and investments we need to make to try to achieve this outcome so that we can use that to kind of to provide for that better future for people. We even broke it down by subregions and other things, and in particular what I want you to see is that the biggest change in those increments are in New York City and northern New Jersey. In New York City has grown. 10 years ago, Mayor Bloomberg put out his Plan YC 2030 that said by 2030 we may add 1 million New Yorkers and we have to have capacity for them. Over 10 years they added those 1 million New Yorkers, and we're up to 8.6 million today. New York City's kind of official plans say it's going to get to 9 million fairly soon and then cap off and stop growing. That's actually not going to happen. What's going to happen is rents are going to shoot through the roof, severe overcrowding will happen, the subways will get worse, quality of life will decline. But that's kind of their official policy. What we see is that New York and northern New Jersey have the potential to continue to grow, both in terms of population and in terms of jobs. So in many ways, these are the two areas that have the most at stake in pursuing these kinds of policies and figuring out what to do. And we then kind of modeled out what that would mean in terms of new ridership and what kind of capacity we have to solve for. And so from the RPA perspective, I'm trying to figure out ways that we can get another 150,000 people under the Hudson River on a daily basis. And we can do it, but we're going to have to make some changes. So the plan we put out talks about equity, health, prosperity, and sustainability as goals. I'm not going to go through all 61 recommendations, Kevin, but I wanted to kind of pull out a few, and they're in these kind of 4 buckets. Fixing the institutions that are failing us. This is everything from the Port Authority and the MTA and New Jersey Transit, down to, I think, school districts and local zoning and other things that we really ought to be kind of focused on. Rising to the challenge of climate change, creating a new, modern, dynamic, customer-oriented transportation system, and then fixing our affordability crisis. I just pulled out a few key recommendations that I thought folks here should think about in particular. The first one, and I've been hitting on this a lot, but this transit network is the lifeblood of our region and our economy. New Jersey Transit, New Jersey in many ways, over the 80s and 90s, was engaged in a high-level policy experiment, which was we created New Jersey Transit, we invested in the system, we made a series of capital investments, Midtown Direct Service, the Secaucus Transfer, the Montclair Connection, which made it easier for people to get to Manhattan. And then we put policies in place. I see my friend Carlos Rodriguez, who also worked at the state, who did a lot of work on this. Brownfields changes, rehab codes, the state plan, lots of things that made it easier for downtowns to redevelop and provide housing. So we incentivized people to live near transit and we provided better service into the city. And it worked. And it was a huge success. Today, every single one of NJ Transit's kind of policies and ideas is on the back burner because they can't invest in the system to have people get stranded in Newark, which is what will happen. And the system, Thursday night, I don't know, anybody commute, anyone else who got stuck in Penn Station on Thursday night for a couple of hours in the mob scene? It's dangerous. By the way, 2 years ago, there was a kind of incident at Penn Station where a popping sound went off. People thought it was a gun. 16 people ended up in the hospital, and it was absolutely nothing. If there actually were an incident at Penn Station, it is a death trap. It really is deeply unsafe. And it all relies on these tunnels that are 108 years old, that move each day with the tide because they were built in the sludge, and so they slide by a couple of feet every day. And they were flooded during Superstorm Sandy. And so after the flooding, Amtrak hired a consultant to do a study, and they put out this confidential assessment which said that in less than 20 years, we are going to need to shut these tunnels down for a couple of years to rebuild this over-century-old infrastructure. And that was before, we were worried about these tunnels before Superstorm Sandy. Now we are literally living on borrowed time. So Amtrak is working, and just to give you a sense, if they close one at a time to do those repairs, it's not a 50% reduction. Because trains have to move in both directions. We can't just run trains all the way in the morning and then run them all the way out in the evening because there's no capacity in New York for the trains. You have to keep them moving in both directions. So it doesn't go from 24 to 12 trains an hour. It goes from 24 to close to 6. Maybe they could get 7 or 8 out of it. That would be an economic death blow to our state. The crisis that this would produce, I think it would actually create, it would trigger a mini recession in the entire Northeast, which would ripple across the country. Amtrak has been working on this project called Gateway. The first phase of it is to build a new bridge over the portal, over the Passaic River, the Portal Bridge, replacing a bridge that sometimes is to open for shipping and then can't be closed again. This project, it is an enormously expensive project. You may have read about it. In the waning days of the Obama administration, there was a deal for New Jersey to basically pay for a quarter of it, New York to pay for a quarter of it, and the feds to pay for half. That deal is now off the table because of a kind of personal vendetta, as far as I can tell, between the president and Senator Schumer. The first phase of it, New Jersey has come up with the 50% funding, and we're simply waiting for the feds to sign off on the environmental statements. And an administration that says it's going to cut through the red tape and move projects faster has now been sitting for over 6 months on a piece of paper that Secretary Chow needs to sign to move this forward. So this is scandalous. And we are all basically at risk because of this. And so getting Gateway built and funded has got to be one of the highest priorities virtually for everybody living in the tri-state metropolitan. We want to see it extended out to Queens and other things too, but just getting this project going is vitally critical. And then what it'll mean, with the new tunnels built under the Hudson River, we renovate the old tunnels, and then we would have the capacity for generations growth of new ridership. Then, of course, we'll have to deal with the hell that is Penn Station, the seventh circle of hell, as Governor Cuomo likes to call it. This area, there's an enormous amount happening in this area right now. Just to give you a sense, Moynihan Station, the old Farley Post Office, is going to open up in just 2 years as a new transit hub. Unfortunately, it won't be serving any of you because it's for the Long Island Railroad and Amtrak customers, but it is going to be a pretty stunning area, a very nice amenity, and it's going to siphon, I don't know, about 10% of the people out of Penn Station. 2 years after that, East Side Access will open up, and 50% of the Long Island Railroad riders, about a quarter of people using Penn Station, will shift to going to Grand Central. What that means is that January 1st, 2023 is the day that anything big that's going to happen here should happen, starts happening. That's the day the jackhammers and the cranes should go in. Amtrak won't talk about this because they're having so much trouble with the Portal Bridge, but eventually they need to build a new train station and essentially demolish the block to the south of Penn Station and build a new Penn South there. There are a lot of ideas about moving the garden, and that's something that I'm very passionate about we're trying to do, and seeing Vornado, which owns most of the real estate in this area, kind of move. All of us have, this is the hard thing for us. We don't really have any agency in this, and yet we have a stake in the outcome of what happens here. And I kind of think of Moynihan as a lost opportunity because it's not really going to be serving any of us. Another thing I'll just talk about in terms of large-scale infrastructure. On Thursday morning, I was sitting at the governor's table at an event where he talked about, where he rolled out a $13 billion expansion of Kennedy Airport, of which the Port Authority will pay $1 billion and $12 billion will come from the private sector, essentially taking the lessons they've learned from LaGuardia, which you might have heard is a nightmare, and it is right now, but in about 2 years, LaGuardia Airport is going to open up, and it's going to be a world-class area for the first time. It's really going to be quite transformative. And Kennedy is now planning for that too. Newark needs an overhaul of a similar scale. Newark Airport, if we added a 4th runway to Newark Airport, connected it to the Northeast Corridor so that you could really get transit there efficiently, and improved all the runways and the gates, it could be the size of Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport, which is an economic driver. 6 years ago, we did a study talking about how we were at about 100 million passengers coming through Kennedy, LaGuardia, Newark, and Teterboro at the time. And we said by mid-century, we're going to get to 150 million, and we ought to start to plan for that. In those 6 years, we got halfway there. We've seen a 25% increase in air travel in and out of our airports in just 6 years. But we are very close to the cap. Basically, the airlines did it by those smaller seats and all the other things that are going on. What we should be doing is something like this. This was Gensler, an architecture team, came up with a proposal for us showing what a kind of full capacity Newark Airport could look like. And the Port Authority, This is with an additional runway. This is with a connection on the northeast corridor, so high-speed trains and everything would stop there. It essentially moves the main terminal to the northeast corridor and then has transit links out to the gates. Finally, and I will wrap up, in terms of housing, there are a couple things that ought to be happening in communities like this. We looked at just zoning codes, and in particular, if in communities like Princeton and parts of Mercer and Middlesex counties, if we simply make it easier to allow the granny flat, the above the garage apartment added in, and we simply allow just 1 out of 10 houses in certain types of communities to do that over the next generation, it would produce 500,000 new homes without any new construction in our communities. We are going to see an increase in our over 65 population, and this is the kind of product that they are very interested in seeing. And this ought to be a strategy. This is where the 781 municipalities in their individual zoning have a big role to play in thinking about what we do to allow more infill housing. The other big housing opportunity are train stations. And I will say that I consider Princeton Junction a kind of daily affront to everything I've done in my career. It is wasted public resources and space. And I have a car and I drive out there every day and I pay for the parking and the gas and the depreciation on the car. Summit, New Jersey did an experiment with this. Up in Toronto, Canada, they've been experimenting with this. What we are going to start to see over the next couple of years is the for-hire vehicle companies are going to get into this space and they're going to start to provide cheaper, better alternatives where they will drive people to and from the train stations. If we simply took about 3/4 of a surface parking within a half mile of train stations in this region and converted it to redevelopment, not high scale, not condos and other things, but just low level development with parks and schools and other amenities around them, we calculated that we could create another 250,000 homes over the next generation within walking distance of train stations. This has got to be a major priority for us. And I don't know if this is where they're going, but on Monday when Governor Murphy announced his economic vision for the state, he talked about how the Economic Development Authority and New Jersey Transit would start to work more closely together. That's what they ought to be thinking about. Because it's publicly owned land, it's flat, it has infrastructure connected to it, and it's not generating any jobs, any housing, any tax base for us. It's a huge wasted opportunity, and it's something we should be thinking about. Just a couple kind of other big things. We ought to be moving towards California's cap and trade. We are part, thanks to Governor Murphy, brought us back into RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where we put a small price on the energy sector, and we use it to invest in renewables. In California, they're building high-speed rail because they also put a price on in the transportation sector of the economy, and they use that to invest. And if we did that, we could essentially get all of the kinds of investments I've talked about. And then finally, this isn't our backyard, but I'll just say, we also looked at climate change, sea level rise, and what's likely to happen. And there are 2 places in the region that stand out. Southeast Queens, around Kennedy Airport, Jamaica Bay, and the Meadowlands are low-lying areas that are going to be flooded by mid-century. And there's just nothing you can do. You can't build a barrier to keep the water out because it's also coming downstream. And rather than kind of fight it on a piecemeal basis, and what we have now is there are about 18 municipalities in this image, and each of them is thinking individually about what it can do to prevent the flooding. And what they will do is effectively flood their neighbors. They'll push the water out, and the water's got to go somewhere. And instead of kind of fighting trench warfare in a slow retreat that way, we said, let's think of the Meadowlands as the first climate resilience park in the nation. Let's create a proactive vision of where we go. And in particular, the first piece of this, there's a lot of public land in here, including Teterboro Airport, which by mid-century will no longer be viable because it will be flooded. And so it's time to start thinking about a vision for that, where instead of just trying to push the water out, we say, here are the areas that we're going to retreat from where the water can come in. That will protect the other areas where people live or we have infrastructure that we need, and try and be more forward-thinking on that. And then the final slide, I promise, is just also thinking about a trail network. Because if I wasn't here speaking to you this morning, I'd probably be out biking with Pete Morgan. So thinking about the trails that we have here in Princeton and in Mercer County, which are so extraordinary, but how we can connect up to the rest of the region. both as a way of allowing people access to this wonderful, bountiful open space, and as a way of getting around, which is the future. Thank you for giving me a chance to run through that all.